There are moments in a life that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with warning or ceremony. They simply appear small and still under a circle of pale light on a frozen road, waiting to change everything you thought you knew about yourself. That night, the temperature had been dropping since noon. Daniel Mercer was 53 years old, a man who'd long since made peace with the quiet rhythms of his life. Early mornings, long shifts at the county maintenance yard, evenings that belonged to him and his cat, Milo, and not much else. He wasn't the kind of man who looked for things. He was the kind of man things happened to anyway. He was 3 blocks from home when he saw it. The street lamp on the corner of Birch and Route 9 throws a yellow cone of light onto the sidewalk in winter, always has, probably always will, and at the edge of that cone, half buried in a crust of wind-packed snow, something small was lying motionless. His first thought was that a barn cat had wandered too far from the farms on the edge of town. It happened. Cold snaps took them fast. He slowed the truck, told himself he'd check, told himself it would only take a minute. He stepped out into wind that cut straight through his jacket. What he saw stopped him where he stood. It wasn't a barn cat. The coat was spotted, pale amber blurring into cream at the belly, dark rosette-shaped markings across the flanks. The ears, even pressed flat against the cold, carried small tufts at the tips. The paws, curled inward like folded hands, were enormous for an animal this size. The paws of something that hadn't finished growing yet, that was meant one day to be fast and fierce and entirely free. A bobcat kitten, maybe 8-9 weeks old, lying in the snow as though it had simply given up. Daniel knelt down beside it. He pulled off one glove and pressed 2 fingers to its neck. The pulse was there, thread-thin, barely a whisper, but it was there. He didn't think about what came next. He unzipped his coat, tucked the kitten against his chest, zipped the coat back up around it, and walked fast back to the truck. The next hour moved the way emergencies do, without pause, without the luxury of doubt. He ran warm water over his hands and used them as a compress. He found the old heating pad in the hall closet, the one he'd bought years ago for a bad back, and set it to its lowest setting, covered it in a soft towel, and laid the kitten there in the corner of the kitchen. He worked slowly, carefully, the way a man works when he is afraid and choosing not to show it. No sudden movements, no bright lights, just warmth and stillness, and the quiet discipline of staying present. He told himself what you tell yourself in those moments. Just one night, get it through the night. Tomorrow you call the wildlife center. Tomorrow someone who knows what they're doing takes over. He'd said something like that before, years ago, when he'd found Milo half drowned in a drainage ditch during a summer storm, a scrawny gray kitten no one was coming back for. He'd said just one night then too. That was 11 years ago. Milo had been watching from the hallway since Daniel first came through the door. That was his way, patient, observant, a cat who assessed before he committed to anything. He'd seen the bundle under Daniel's coat. He'd heard the faint, irregular sounds coming from the kitchen floor. And now he stood at the edge of the hallway, amber eyes wide and steady, reading the room the way cats do, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something that looked almost unsettlingly like consideration. Daniel watched him. "Easy, Mill," he said softly. "It's okay, just stay back." Milo did not stay back. He crossed the kitchen floor in 4 quiet steps, lowered himself slowly beside the heating pad, and extended his nose toward the kitten's matted face. He sniffed once, twice, his tail moved in one slow arc, and then, without hesitation, without anything that resembled caution, he began to groom the kitten's frozen ears. Long, deliberate strokes, methodical, gentle, the way a mother cleans a newborn she's decided to claim. Daniel sat back on his heels and said nothing for a long moment. He was a practical man. A man who'd spent 30 years fixing broken things and didn't put much stock in the idea that the world operated on anything other than hard work and dumb luck. But there are things that stop you cold regardless of what you believe, things that reach past the practical mind and land somewhere deeper, somewhere older. What he was watching was one of those things. A house cat, 11 years domesticated, who had every biological reason to retreat from a wild predator, had instead leaned in and offered the only comfort he knew how to give. The kitten didn't move, but its breathing shifted. Almost imperceptibly, the rapid, shallow flutter of its chest began to slow into something more deliberate, something less desperate, Milo settled lower against it, tucking his chin over its spotted flank. His purr filled the room, low and constant, more vibration than sound, the kind of purr that isn't about happiness so much as it is about intention. "I'm here," it seemed to say. "You're not alone in this." Daniel leaned against the kitchen cabinet, coat still on, and decided he wasn't going to sleep. Outside, the wind pushed hard against the windows. Inside, under a single lamp, a gray tabby and a wild kitten breathed together in the dark, and something that could not have been planned, could not have been predicted, quietly began. Daniel had set an alarm for 6 in the morning. He didn't need it. He woke at 5 to the sound of nothing. No crying, no distress, and found Milo curled tight around the Bobcat kitten like a living blanket, his chin resting over its spotted shoulders. The kitten's small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm now. Its paws, those impossibly oversized paws, twitched once in its sleep as though it were already dreaming of running somewhere. Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment and didn't reach for the phone. He told himself he'd call the wildlife center after breakfast. He called them 3 days later. In the space between, something unfolded that he didn't have a clean word for. The Bobcat, which he refused to name, because naming things makes leaving harder, recovered faster than he expected. By the second day it was lifting its head. By the third it was attempting to stand, legs trembling and wide set, like a newborn deer finding the logic of its own body. Milo was there for every attempt. When the kitten wobbled and sat back down hard, Milo simply touched his nose to its forehead and waited. The toys appeared without explanation. A crinkle ball from under the couch, a feather wand Daniel hadn't touched in years. Milo deposited them at the kitten's feet one by one, with the quiet gravity of a cat who had decided this was his job now and wasn't looking for feedback. Daniel tried separating them once, gently moving Milo to the bedroom, closing the door, giving the Bobcat space. Milo sat at the door and cried in a register. Daniel had never heard from him before, not demanding, not annoyed, something closer to grief. He opened the door after 7 minutes. He didn't try again. By the end of the first week the kitten was eating, soft food at first, then small pieces of raw meat that Daniel sourced quietly, and without fully examining his own reasoning. It was teething on a chair leg. It was pouncing on shadows with a precision that was nothing like a house cat's play. Sharper, more committed, instinct already sharpening beneath the softness. But every evening it pressed its spotted flank against Milo and slow blinked in the lamplight, and Milo slow blinked back. Daniel watched them from across the room and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the particular unguarded warmth of witnessing a bond that asked nothing of him and gave him everything anyway. He still hadn't named the Bobcat, but he'd stopped pretending that was going to matter. The Bobcat grew the way wild things do, not gradually but in sudden, almost startling increments, as though his body were catching up to something his instincts already knew. One morning he was small enough to sleep tucked under Milo's chin. 2 weeks later he was nearly the same length, his legs long and angular, his paws landing with a new weight when he moved across the kitchen floor. He still played with the crinkle ball, but now when he pounced the linoleum cracked beneath him. Now when he climbed he reached the top of the bookcase in 3 effortless moves and surveyed the room from above with pale, unblinking eyes that held no apology in them at all. Milo watched him from the couch, still calm, still certain, but Daniel watched them both and began to feel the slow, quiet arrival of something he'd been avoiding. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was professional and kind. The woman on the phone told him what he already knew. The Bobcat was healthy, thriving, and approaching the window where transitioning back to a natural habitat would still take. Every week beyond that window made it harder, for the animal, for the wild, for the instincts that needed open land and solitude to fully form. She used words like responsible and humane, and what's best for him. Daniel wrote none of it down. He didn't need to. He'd known it was coming the same way you know a season is changing, not by any single moment, but by the accumulation of them. He built the outdoor enclosure on a Saturday. Cedar posts, wire mesh, 2 climbing platforms, a shelter box lined with dry grass. It was good work. He was proud of it in the hollow way you're proud of things that cost you something. The Bobcat took to it immediately. He stalked the perimeter with his nose lifted, reading scents Daniel couldn't begin to catalog. He climbed to the highest platform and sat there in the late afternoon light, watching the tree line with an attention that was ancient and absolute. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't confused. He was, for the first time, exactly where part of him had always been trying to go. But each evening when the light dropped and the air cooled, he came down from the platform and pressed his full weight against the glass door, looking inside, looking for Milo. And Milo was always there, one gray paw resting against the glass, matching him perfectly. Daniel stood between the two of them and understood, with the particular ache of loving something correctly, that doing right by the bobcat was going to feel exactly like loss. Spring came the way it always does in the Northeast, not all at once but in concessions. A warm afternoon here, a cold morning pushing back, and then one day, the tree line behind Daniel's yard exhaled into green, and there was no arguing with it anymore. The wildlife staff came on a Tuesday, two of them quiet and respectful, the kind of people who understood that what was happening in that yard was more than a standard release. They didn't rush him. They let Daniel and Milo walk the enclosure one last time while they waited near the gate. The bobcat moved alongside them, not with the urgency of a wild thing caged too long, but with something almost ceremonial about it. He pressed the crown of his head against Daniel's knee. He touched his nose to Milo's face and held it there for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. Then he stepped back, turned toward the open gate, and looked over his shoulder once, just once, and walked into the tree line without hesitation. The house was louder in its silence than Daniel expected. Milo wandered the rooms for days, checking corners, sitting in the hallway outside the back door, calling out in that low, searching register that Daniel had heard only once before. He ate, he slept, but something in him was visibly, quietly waiting. Daniel understood the feeling completely. He just didn't know how to explain it to either of them. He told himself he'd done the right thing. He believed it. But belief and peace are not always the same thing, and that first week he felt their difference acutely. He'd mounted a trail camera on the old oak at the edge of the property mostly out of habit. He almost didn't check it. 3 weeks after the release, he sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and scrolled through the footage. There, at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, the bobcat stood at the wood's edge, bigger now, broader across the chest, his coat vivid in the infrared light, every inch of him carrying the easy confidence of an animal fully returned to himself. He was healthy in a way that made Daniel exhale slowly and set down his mug. And then the audio. Milo crying softly from the porch, and from the tree line, faint, low, unmistakable, an answer. Daniel opened the back door the following evening without expectation, without asking for anything. The bobcat emerged just far enough. Milo crossed the porch and touched his nose to his once. They held still together in the dark for a long moment. Two animals on different sides of a threshold, both choosing just briefly to stand at the same one. Then the trees took him back. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched the darkness long after the bobcat had gone. Full, for the first time in weeks, of something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite joy, but felt in the way the truest things do. Remarkably like both. He'd said just one night, but some bonds don't negotiate with time. They simply endure, quietly, stubbornly, across every kind of distance.